A warm welcome to all to this side event to the 66th session of the Commission on the Status of Women on Measuring the Gender Environment Nexus, Filling Data Gaps for Evidence-Based Decision-Making. My name is Papa Sek, and I'm the Chief of the Research and Data Section of UN Women, based in New York. I'm honored to moderate this side event today. This exciting event is co-organized by the Office of the Chief Secretary of the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the National Statistical Office of Mongolia, the United Kingdom Health Security Agency, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, the Pacific Communities, SPC, and the University of Hawaii at Manoa Pacific Disaster Center, PDC. And of course, UN Women, all with the generous support of Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Before diving into this side event, I would like to note a few housekeeping rules. As this is a Zoom webinar format, we have many participants, so your microphones will be on mute the whole time. We, however, encourage you to participate by using the Zoom chat function, and for any questions and comments, we will try to address as many of these as possible through the course of this event. The event includes simultaneous international sign language interpretation and interpretation in Arabic, Mandarin, French, Russian, and Spanish. Please have a look at the Zoom chat function for guidance and how to access these different language services. Closed captions are also available for those who prefer to subtitles for this event. You can enable them in your Zoom settings at the bottom of your screen. Now, let's move on to the reason why we're here today. We organized this event to discuss the importance of enhancing the measurement of the gender environment nexus. We know women and men interact with the environment differently, have different vulnerabilities to climate change, and play different roles in natural resource management. Gender statistics are critical to make these factors visible and to inform adequate policies. However, for many years, the data available to measure these connections has been non-existent. The informational paper prepared for the 66th session of the Commission on the Status of Women, which has just kicked off, sets out a variety of options for national governments and other data producers to fill these existing gaps. And in recent years, many partners have started to working towards filling these gaps and using these new estimates to inform national environmental decisions and to make both women and men visible and taken into account. I'm really excited that through the course of this event today, we will hear from some of these partners who are really doing groundbreaking work in this area, and I hope that you will enjoy it as much as I do. Just in terms of the objective of the event, this is to explore, again, efforts to fill data gaps on gender environment statistics, and to hear about innovative tools being used to generate this data. It is also to examine the importance of using new gender environment data for evidence-based decision-making to find solutions that truly respond to the environmental needs of women, men, and ecosystems. So in terms of the agenda, we will begin with a panel discussion, followed by a question and answer session. And today on our panel, we have the pleasure of having Mr. Badava Bakhmut, who's the chairperson of the National Statistical Office of Mongolia, Ms. Molly Helkena, National Advisor, Early Childhood Development Office of the Chief Secretary of the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Ms. Virginia Murray, who is the head of Global Disaster Risk Reduction at the United Kingdom Health Security Agency, Ms. Sarah Duerto Valero, who's the Regional Advisor on Gender Statistics for UN Women in the Asia Pacific region, Ms. Charlotte Gormans, who's a Policy Analyst, Development Cooperation Directorate of the OECD, and last but not least, Mr. Steve Recker, who's the Humanitarian Assistance Program Advisor at the University of Manoa Pacific Disaster Center. So without further ado, let me just kick off this panel with a question to Molly. Molly, as a user of data on the gender environment nexus, can you please tell us your experience and challenges you face trying to gather data to inform policy baselines in RMI? How do you identify who is producing what data and where to find it? And what role do you think actors beyond the national statistical offices, such as ministries of environment, disaster management, health, and etc., civil society and academia, can play in sharing some of these data? You have 4 minutes. Over to you, Molly. You're on mute.
I apologize. Thank you, moderator. A very good morning and warm greetings of Yahweh from the Republic of the Marshall Islands to everyone here. Before I begin, I want to thank you and women and other organizers for this opportunity for me to share my insights as user of gender data and statistics. And I would also like to acknowledge our distinguished panel members joining me here today. In the Marshall Islands, our National Statistic Office follows UN guidelines for official statistics, with priorities determined by our National Development Plan, economic policies, and resources. The RMI conducts a census of population and housing every 10 years, and other household survey carried out with donor fundings like the 2017 Integrated Child Health and Nutrition Survey. The data we need in the gender policy and human rights obligation is beyond these official statistics. We need data and metrics that reflect on progress and on more regular basis. The official census and survey statistic provides high outcome and output indicators for our gender and human rights work, but this is insufficient for annual progress reporting. Other gender data are often from donor-funded programs and projects implemented by the government agencies and CSO. It took us some time to locate and build relationship across these gender data pockets, providers, and stakeholders. We need these so-called unofficial statistics for gender policy monitoring and evaluation, particularly in environment and climate change, where there is little or currently no official statistics. In the Pacific, we can do more to integrate evidence-based data equality analysis in all our work. We need to make sure that data-driven gender analysis on differentiated roles of women and men, girls and boys in all diversities, relationship, and impact starts at the very beginning of a project program to improve its design and ultimately sustainable impact. We need data that help us understand of specific granular and dynamic issues such as culture, access to resources, allocation of time and labor, as well as knowledge of rights and how these rights are being realized for different communities, islands, or atolls. We also have to start thinking beyond national borders for climate change crisis related data to total impact population. The Marshall Islands is matrilineal, and our traditional female leaders carry the millennia-old knowledge and guardians of the land, water, and biodiversity of living things, including family and community. The responsibility of women pass on the traditional knowledge to new generation is affected by climate crisis. Women and mothers are responsible for ensuring a healthy diet, providing traditional medicine and healing practices, sustaining household economies, and taking care of the land, water, and sacred places. Climate crisis disrupts the transmission of traditional knowledge connected to nurturing and more broadly interacting with natural environment and ecosystem because they are disappearing. The intangible cultural heritage is not captured in data system and by its nature is protected and private knowledge, handed down generation to generation. That said, traditional knowledge must be safeguarded somehow amidst all disruption and during these uncertain times. The climate change knowledge holders and therefore data makers are beyond the typical statistic office. We need the data, her story. So to my response to your question is, to your last question, is that yes, other actors do play an important role for us to better understand women in our region, more specifically the Marshall Islands. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Molly, for your response. And this is really interesting. And here, you know, just perhaps I think a follow up to your question, to your answer, to say, you know, have you seen any promising practices in this area that you think are worth sustaining, right? You know, in terms of how you are engaging with producers and users really to make sure that some of this data gets shared. You're on mute.
Yeah, again, one of the things that I think that it's very important is that, you know, when we work with stakeholders, you know, we be mindful that, you know, we have civil society and NGOs that also carry out some of the data that we want, that are not tested or in the official data system at our national office, statistic office. So working with them and trying to get some of the answers that we want to collect and capture, to making sure that we do proper reporting every year is you know, is something that, you know, we continue to work more closely with our partners and stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Molly. And you know, I will come back to you later, I think, in the conversation. So over to you, Virginia. The COVID-19 crisis has made it abundantly clear that data are essential for targeting crisis response. And in this context, in the context of the climate crisis, you've done incredible work to contribute to better measurement, including by contributing to the reports of the IPCC and to the creation of a hazard classification together with the UN disaster risk reduction and others. Can you give us some examples from your work using data to inform crisis response so that it can benefit women, men, girls, and boys? You have 4 minutes. Over to you, Virginia.
Papa, what an honor to be here. And so it's good morning, good afternoon, good evening to people and colleagues around the world. To me, data is simply critical, and I thank you for showing my slides. COVID-19 has been such a wake-up call for the world. It has affected all of us. And this is the information from the World Health Organization dashboard on COVID-19, where every country is responsible to report under the international health regulations from their Ministry of Health to the World Health Organization. You will note that they have confirmed over 450 million cases of COVID-19. A most enormous number for all the cases that have happened across the world. And that of the deaths, we know that they have confirmed over 6 million, but concern about the number of deaths has always remained. But one very good piece of news here is some of the work that the UK was fortunate enough to lead on with many partners was the development of a vaccine. And you will see on the 13th of March that it was reported that over 10 billion vaccine doses have already been administered. So really critical, but we know that many, many more are needed. So data is key. And if we can move on to the next slide, you will see that in the UK, we report this data as well routinely, and this also comes from the WHO dashboard. And you will notice here that we have identified over 19 million cases, over 160,000 deaths, and that we see these coming in waves. And you'll note that the initial waves before the vaccine were really critical for the numbers of deaths that occurred, but now that our vaccine preparedness is now in place, very, very good news is that we are beginning to reduce the number of deaths. But the data is only as good as we can make it. So if you go on to the next slide, you will note that this is the pyramid for reporting on deaths. This is the past year of looking at the 28 and 60-day positive COVID-19 tests associated with deaths. And you'll see that we have two different death definitions that we use, mortality definitions. So the 28-day is a death in a person with a positive COVID-19 test who died within or equal to less than 28 days of the most recent episode of COVID infection. The 60-day death is a death which has happened either of somebody positive who died within the 60 days or where a death certificate reports COVID. Now, I think what's so important here is that actually defining anything is so critical to statistics. And this is something that we share with everyone. So perhaps if we could go on to the next slide, please. Laris, next slide. You'll note that we have been really concerned about how we improve our definitions. Definitions have been absolutely critical, and the work that we have been doing, and I've been fortunate enough to chair for UNDRR and the International Science Council through the technical working group, we have developed a hazard definition and classification review technical report, which I show you on the top, and the hazard information profiles, which are below. These both support the Sendai framework of disaster risk reduction, the Sustainable Development Goals, and indeed the Paris Agreement on climate change by providing a common set of hazard definitions for monitoring and reviewing implementation. They address hydrometeorological, extraterrestrial, geological, environmental, chemical, biological, technological, and although not in the Sendai framework, societal hazards. But then if we use this, we have a way of trying to all work together to understand what we are understanding through data and how we can improve our knowledge.
Brilliant. No, really, thank you. Thank you very much, Virginia, for this. And, again, you're absolutely on point. The fact that basically it is only by defining things that we can actually measure them. Without the definitions, essentially, the measures really do not mean much. So just looking into the future, how do you expect governments to use this hazard profile information? And what do you think can be done to ensure that the reporting to the Sendai framework includes consistent and better gender measures beyond just disaggregation?
Well, gender measures are absolutely key, Papa. We need to do this all the time, because if we don't know what is happening to individual groups, we really cannot support them well enough. So the hazard information profiles very much are reflected of the definitions that were requested. And by implementing it across these 3 UN landmark agreements, we very much hope that we will be able to deliver solutions that will really work for individual countries. The Sendai Framework Monitor is beginning to implement and use this, but we've had huge support from the World Meteorological Organization and many other networks. And online at the moment is my good friend Kanza Ahmed, who I'm really grateful for working with me, but she and our teams is working very closely with the Intergovernmental Expert Group on disaster-related statistics to see how these will be used. And that's linking closely to the UN Statistical Commission, the UNDRR, and many other agencies, which we believe will be a really helpful way forward. So opportunities are there. Opportunities for engagement are being developed, not only by individuals, but also by international organizations. But we really hope every single scientist in the world that if they want to work on a hazard, will preferably use our hazard definitions as a way of making sure that we all speak a common language. And that to me is so important with all the engagement with UN Women and the leadership they've shown in delivering so much of this.
Thank you very much, Virginia. And absolutely, I think there's also an important role that all of us here, in this webinar have a role to play in terms of, our advocacy, but also sharing this information to those who are susceptible to using it. So really, again, excellent work, and thank you very much. And I just wanted to remind all the audience, those who are attending, feel free to use the chat function at will. If you have anything to share or any comments or any questions for our panel members, please feel free to use the chat function. And so just moving on to our own Sarah. Sarah, you're leading some really, fascinating technical work on gender and environment data in the Asia Pacific region and globally. Can you tell us about some of the initiatives and innovations currently taking place to produce better gender environment data and to promote their use? What do you think is the potential of that data to inform inclusive environmental policies in countries? 4 minutes. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Papa. I'll share my screen, but let me begin by just saying that in order to actually create inclusive environmental policies, we're going to need a lot more than just the quote unquote classic indicators that we're currently dealing with, right? Like we have a lot of environment indicators within the SDGs, a lot of environment indicators within Sendai. We have the new set of gender and climate change indicators, etc. But from a gender angle, these indicators still fall a little bit short if we want to capture like the broad spectrum of gender issues. And that's why for a while in UN Women, in partnership with many other agencies, we have been working on trying to generate new data from data collection, but also on using some of the data that we already have to create new estimates on this gender environment nexus. So as you can see on the screen, we recently released a model questionnaire on gender and the environment. This questionnaire was put together in partnership with many agencies, so UNDRR, UNEP, IUCN, ILO, FAO, SCAP, SPC, etc. It includes 10 modules. The first 2 are at the household level, so just one member of the household responds. They're about household characteristics, but the remaining modules are at the individual level, meaning that we are asking questions to both one adult male and one adult female in the household to really get both perspectives. And they cover anything and everything about the gender and environment nexus, right? So there's a module on disasters, there's a module on climate change, on green jobs, agriculture, land use, environmental related livelihoods, asset ownership, etc. So as I said, and this goes back to what Virginia was saying earlier about the importance of really making sure that we use the same common definitions, etc. We use international statistical standards where they exist. For instance, the modules on climate change and disasters actually use the hazard classification list that Virginia was mentioning earlier. So we're all on the same page in that regard to measure all of these issues. So, and we will be hearing very soon from the National Statistics Office in Mongolia, who has actually already implemented this survey at the national level. So besides Mongolia, the survey has already also been implemented in some disaster-prone regions in Bangladesh, and we are currently working with other countries such as Samoa, the Solomon Islands, etc., to implement the survey later this year. So that's generating a lot of new information on gender and the environment that we didn't have. But in addition to that, we are actually looking at some of the data that's already there. And we're integrating geospatial information with survey data, with DHS data. So, and we're running multivariate logistic regression models and random forest models. And we're seeing really that there's several climate-related factors like drought episodes, flood risk, aridity, increases in temperatures, how far one lives from oceans, from lakes, etc. They really have an effect on several gender-related outcomes, such as child marriage, adolescent birth rates, intimate partner violence, availability of clean water, clean fuels in the households, etc. So the map that you see there is Timor-Leste. It shows very clearly in blue the aridity index. So the darker blue dots are the more humid clusters, and the lighter blue dots are the more arid clusters. And the yellow dots are the clusters with high intimate partner violence. So there's clearly a correlation there, which is very important to note. And when we run this analysis across countries and for many other indicators and outcomes, we see similar things. So here on the screen, you see across countries, child marriage rates are higher in arid clusters. And similarly, adolescent birth rates are higher in arid clusters, right? So when you start running this analysis, you start seeing, okay, there's a pattern here. So very clear connections between climate change and gender-related outcomes. You can find some of these findings in this report that we just released. Besides finding some data integration work, we have also reprocessed other data in partnership with colleagues across different UN agencies. So we've used, for instance, ILO data to look at wage gaps in the agriculture, fishery, and forestry sector. We've worked with SPC to collect data from power utilities in the Pacific, power utility firms, to see how many women are represented, how many women are managers, technicians, etc. We process some of the survey data available in the Pacific, etc. So lots of food for thought, and I encourage people to go to data.unwomen.org and explore some of these findings. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sarah. And again, I definitely suggest dropping the links to those documents in the chat. Really, fantastic work. So there's a question in the chat for you, and which is what do we mean by when we say nexus? So can you take that while you're at it?
That's a difficult question because it's so broad, right? So we're, as I was saying, like when we look at the gender environment nexus in general, we look at different environmental issues that affect women and men differently, or that affect perhaps only women or only men, right? So it covers everything and anything from like who's more exposed to disasters, to what are people's capacity to cope with disasters, with climate change, to the types of jobs people engage in, whether people own assets and how resilient they are to cope with some of these phenomena, who makes decisions within the household about use of resources, or who drives to work versus taking public transportation, right? It covers a lot of different issues, the jobs that people have, etc. So just anything that has to do with differences between men and women in older diversities in the context of natural resource management, climate change, disasters, all the many different areas within environment statistics. We consider that the gender environment nexus.
Great, excellent. Thank you very much, Sarah. And really, I think that drives home the fact that basically there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think it's related to one question in the chat about, the fact that there are many actors who actually, speak their own language in this ecosystem. And, this is a point that I think we will come back to, often in this conversation. So, Sarah, I think a question to you is basically, the UN Statistics Division, GEDA, and many other UN agencies are currently working towards generating better environment statistics. And we have an excellent opportunity here to ensure that these efforts really integrate a gender perspective. And you are definitely involved in that. So can you tell us more about these efforts and what can be done to integrate a gender perspective across the board?
Thank you. Yeah. So as I was saying earlier, I think the gender and environment nexus is so broad, right? Like we need all the help we can get really to measure all the different parts. So it's very important that many different actors are working on this, and it's very important that we all kind of coordinate and work together. So GEDA, for instance, which is the Gender Environment Data Alliance, was created within the framework of the Action Coalition for Climate Justice, and I'm sure a lot of people here in the room know about this already. But it's a good example of many different actors coming together, from civil society, from UN agencies, from governments, etc., to really promote the use of existing data. So that's what GEDA does. They do a lot of advocacy, etc. So it's important work. Then we have people like UNSC, which we know are very well placed to lead on the global norm development and the coordination across agencies, etc. And I'm sure for all of us involved in the environment data world, we know that the recent adoption of the set of climate change indicators, right? So an important joint initiative, and many different agencies and governments kind of weigh in. So again, very important to coordinate all of this work. And then we have all the different UN agencies and national governments that are collecting data on many different topics, right? Like, so ILO works with governments to collect data on the world of work and labor force surveys, and FAO on agriculture, and we have the model questionnaire on gender and environment. So integrating gender across all these parts, across all these areas of work is very important. So again, going back to our model questionnaire, this is the reason why we work together with so many different actors to make sure that gender basically it was integrated across all the topics that all the different actors work, but their work was also integrated across our model questionnaire. Yeah, so I think, you know, in a nutshell, it's very important that we all continue working with each other as much as we can. And, you know, the current technology and the current state of the world, which has forced us also everybody to kind of like work from home and all that, it's actually helpful in contributing to this. You're muted.
Yeah, no, and thanks, Sarah. And this definitely, I think, speaks to you know, one of the questions about a common understanding, you know, having adequate definitions in terms of how do we measure indicators. And, you know, again, this group that is being created is really meant to do that. So really, I think, you know, bringing together different stakeholders with different expertise to start to develop those, you know, that common measurement framework, indicators and so on, to really, I think, get us to a point where we all have a common understanding of what we are measuring and how to use that data. Thank you, Sarah. So just moving on to Badava, we know that Mongolia recently implemented the first nationally representative survey on gender and the environment nexus. This is an important milestone, especially because the data can be used to monitor the country's Vision 2030. What are some of the key findings that you expect will be useful to inform the implementation of the vision and other possible policies? You have four minutes.
Thank you very much, Papa. And having this opportunity, we would like to express our gratitude for UN Women for enabling us to share our experience with regards to gender and environment nexus. As you know, we are implementing a project called Improving Gender Statistics with the focus on environment with the UN Women. As part of the project, we have conducted first nationally representative survey on the gender and environment nexus, and we have completed the data collection process. Now, the raw data of the survey has been forwarded to the UN Women for tabulation and processing. The reason we have conducted this survey is that it's basically understood that women are more vulnerable to climate change and disasters, which could be one of the primary causes of the livelihood deprivedness of the women. And also in terms of the disaster response planning, it's deemed that the participation of the women is low, and also the women is deemed to be more dependent on environment through the food and fuel, especially the countryside women. So that's why we have started with this project. And we think the key findings from the project will enable us to find or assess the data for the disaster statistics, and also it will really help us to assess the disaster preparedness and also the responsiveness and planning. And also we think we'll be able to have a quite gender segregated data on the employment and the income and livelihood impact of the natural disasters and the climate change, so that our national response planning could be more suited, especially with the country like Mongolia, which has a quite sparsely populated. And in our Vision 2030, which is our long-term planning, there's some indicators and targets with, related to gender disparity and protecting and improving the livelihood of those vulnerable part of the population. And also there's a clause indicating to promote the sustainable agriculture. So all this will be helping us to establish the baseline indicators for us to assess our progress towards these national vision goals. So this is basically a brief answer to your question. Over to you, Papa.
Thank you very much, Badara. So there's actually a question that we received in advance for you, which is, that given that Mongolia is one of the few countries reporting sex disaggregated data under the Sendai framework, how did you get there? What was your experience? And really, I think, what made that possible?
Yeah, we would say that first of all, the baseline was our national registration system is quite well developed. Starting from the 80s, we have this comprehensive national registration system. And also, though we have quite a big land, the population is quite small. And currently, the population of the country is 3.4 million. So in terms of the data collection, it makes us easier to conduct census and the surveys. And of course, starting from the early 2012 and 2017, we've been working with the UN system organizations to improve the gender disaggregated data quite in a, I would say, in an organized way. So this really helped us to come up with these necessary indicators. But I would say that we have also much room for the improvement with regards to the gender statistics.
Yeah, certainly. I think, definitely, I think gender statistics generally has a, there are several challenges that we all are trying to resolve. But I think what is really important here, really, I think, is also your country's commitment to actually do something about this, and that's I think absolutely critical. So, another question that actually came for you is really, looking at, how are you involving particular groups? Particularly, I think a question around, how are you involving youth in data, in basically your data work, whether, it's data collection, communication, or use, or, how you're taking into account youth groups in this work. Yeah, so I think it's really a question around inclusion, particularly of youth.
Yeah, with regards to the youth, I mean, we have, certainly we don't have like a very systematic, strategy of involving the youth in the data collection or something. But in terms of the data dissemination, we have just, completed the data dissemination strategy last year. So it involves targeted, data dissemination and kind of, it's like in terms of the corporate organization, it's kind of the marketing strategy. So we have segmented our data users into the persona groups. For example, the government institutions, youth, especially the students, to improve the data literacy, and also the business people, and etc. So we have come up with different strategies with targeting these groups to better use the data and also to improve their data literacy. So, for example, as a part of our strategy to increase the data literacy of the youth, especially in terms of the gender-related violences, that we are trying to promote the families and also the boys and girls that the early in the childhood, the parenting using the violence could be a main cause of the violence in the future when they become adults. So we try to promote it with our survey results with related to gender violence, targeting the parenting through the schools, etc. So this kind of the dedicated dissemination strategies, I think, will yield in a positive result in the future. Over to you, Papa.
Great. Excellent. No, really, thank you very much for this. And again, I think, the whole issue of inclusion is absolutely critical. But just coming back to you. So when it comes to to partnerships. And you've highlighted this as really as something that is particularly important in your survey. Mongolia's gender environment survey was implemented by the National Statistical Office in partnership with the Disaster Management Agency and other actors. What are your thoughts on the importance of these partnerships within government and beyond for the design and implementation of data collection, and also to promote better data use? Yeah, so definitely I think within governments, but also beyond governments with other actors.
Yes, I would say the cooperating with these different government organizations and also the NGOs and the international organizations is really important. Traditionally, when we talked about the statistics, the NSOs were focused on the production side only. So, but now we have to understand the data has to be demand driven. So, for example, in Mongolia's case, there's a very positive tendency among the public and also the government institutions to improve the policy planning and promote the evidence-based decision making. So I think by partnering with the government agencies before we conduct a survey or census or statistical production, it helps us to understand what are the data needs of their government organizations, so that we can take account of this into the survey questionnaires, so that once the results of the survey is available, so that the usage of these survey results is improved, so that the other government organizations and public understand our work quite well. So this in turn, we think improves the data literacy and the data usage among the not only the government organizations in policy making, but I think it really helps with the public understanding of the data literacy. And why we're talking about the data literacy really promotes the evidence-based decision making, and evidence-based decision making helps us to save the budget, helps us to focus on more vulnerable part of the society, helps us to do a right planning for the society. So I think working with the institutions before starting everything is really crucial. Thank you, Papa.
Excellent. No, really, thank you very much for this. And again, I think I will definitely come back to you later for some reflections on going forward. What do you see as some of the more important things to consider? So over to you, Steve. Academic institutions are often at the forefront of environmental research, and this is something that we can leverage for better measurement of the gender environment nexus. In your view, what is the potential for better collaboration between national statistical systems and academia to leverage innovation to fill gender data gaps?
Thank you, Papa, and great points so far by my fellow panelists. A great discussion. Let me just lead off with some basic points here. First, data is good, right? And that we talked about the standardization of data, the need for kind of broad stakeholder information and connection. So not just from government, but also from NGOs. And Papa, you just mentioned academia as well. And the data, though, is in itself useful, but what we're really trying to drive to is better decision-making using the data. And so one of the questions I was asked here is to set up the panel was to talk about how we might translate data into decision-making. And so I have a couple of slides here that talk about the application of that data into a GIS platform for decision support. This is a Pacific Disaster Center's disaster-aware platform. And it's just a snapshot. I built this slide, I think, on Sunday to show a quick snapshot of events around this particular part of the world with a couple of quick snapshots, just a wildfire in Liberia and the remnants of a tropical cyclone off the southeastern coast of Africa. But the idea is that a quick look, how can we make decisions about the data we have? Next slide, please. the Pacific Disaster Center specifically has worked with partner organizations, the UN, individual countries, regional organizations to gather data to help understand how we can make better decisions around gender-related issues and women and security in particular. And so part of the data that we've gathered and we put into the disaster-aware system is, and you see on the left-hand side of my slide here, some of the categories of the data layers that we have to show how we might think about where we would place resources to enhance resilience, to limit vulnerability. Again, using the data, the validated aspect, we have an instinct perhaps of where weaknesses are, or that we have very vulnerable populations, but using the data to validate that and then to display it. And so next slide, please. What I offer up here is just a way to access disaster aware. If you're an emergency manager, a disaster manager, you're in this field, Disaster Aware Pro is available, and here is how you access it. For those in the general public, there is also just Disaster Aware that you can access from the Pacific Disaster Center's website. Again, the focus here is how do academic institutions partner with government? Papa, to your specific question, I'd like to follow up a little bit more on that. Perhaps we can tease out how, in fact, the relationships are developed and what the value is in working across sectors, but also working with established scientific and research organizations. Papa, over to you, please. And that's the end of my slides. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. And really, I think this is also, I think, the value of using GIS data to understand and support gender analysis. And this information is absolutely critical. And just to I guess a question from me is really, how do you get this information to grassroots organizations who are often, at the forefront of this fight? So, knowing that some of this may be technical, how do you make sure that this information actually gets to them?
Very good question. Thank you. And so, if I can come in through a side door to answer your question, Papa. So that first, there has to be a partnership. It has to be an understanding. As several of us have talked about, to standardize the data, understand the information we're trying to seek, and then to put that in a framework that helps us make decisions. And all of us have talked about that so far. First, on accessibility of the data and the analysis, right? The analysis is and the assessment, the recommendations based on that. So there are geospatial tools that do that. And I've just displayed Disaster Aware on the screen, but that platform, that application is available down to your telephone level, right? So you can access it on your smartphone. You can access it with limited technology. But your point is well taken, that if it's not getting to the end user, if it's not getting to those who will make decisions to improve resilience in a community, that will stem things such as gender violence, that will point us to reducing vulnerability in an area, it's not really helping. So that getting the decision support information to those that need it is absolutely critical. How do you do that? And that's, again, on a practical level, they're using geospatial tools that require some level of technology, but that technology now, again, at your smartphone, that's where we are now.
Absolutely, no, definitely critical. And I think another point is really, I think this also highlights the interconnectedness of data systems, right? So where you're looking at a platform that is about disasters, but at the same time you do also have other data systems that can feed you data on gender-based violence, let's say, whether it's police records or household surveys and so on. Really, a fantastic platform, and thank you very much for sharing. So now over to you, Charlotte. We know that development finance plays a key role in promoting gender equality and climate action. How can we ensure that aid is allocated to support this nexus? How does the OECD monitor these aid flows? And how is this monitoring useful to change allocations?
Thanks a lot, Papa, and hello, everyone. And I want to start by thanking UN Women for this opportunity. The OECD and UN Women were long-standing partners in different areas of our work, and we're really excited to also be working together on the gender environment nexus. So in response to your question, yes, delivering on our commitments on gender equality and climate action is going to require financial investments. And actually, together, development partners, they have to maximize not only the quantity of financing, but also the quality of financing. Now, official development assistance, or what we call ODA, from the 30 members of the OECD Development Assistance Committee, or the DAC, this is and will remain an important source of financing, which in 2020 stood at around $161 billion. And so this ODA data is collected, verified, and then made publicly available by the OECD in what we call the creditor reporting system. So everyone can just go into that database and look at this. Now, the OECD has two sets of markers that track ODA in support of climate change and gender equality. And we have combined these two types of markers to analyze the proportion of ODA that tackles climate change, but at the same time also targets gender equality. And I just want to highlight some elements from the data here. So our data indicates that ODA to climate action stands at around $33.1 billion. And this is higher than ever before. If we then look at the amount of climate ODA that integrates gender equality objectives, this is also on the rise, and it reached around $18.9 billion, which is around 57% of climate ODA. And these numbers are showing us that increasing and important efforts are being deployed by DAC members to link climate action with gender equality. And what we have also seen in this data is that in regions where the gender climate nexus is particularly acute, and I'm thinking about the Sahel or some countries in West Africa, DAC members, they have committed even higher shares of their climate ODA to gender equality. So this is the good news. There is also some bad news, which is that, so the data that I've been mentioning is talking about climate ODA that's both mainstreaming gender equality and also dedicated to gender equality as a principal objective, right? But if we're going to look at climate ODA that's only dedicated to gender equality as the principal objective, so programs only focusing on climate and gender, this remains really scarce at less than 1% of all climate-related ODA. And in addition, even as women play a critical role in climate change response, women's organizations, they remain extremely underfunded. Climate ODA integrating gender equality objectives that goes to these types of organizations only stood at $43 million. So compare this to the overall climate ODA, which is $33.1 billion, and we see that this is very low. What I also want to highlight is that, so these numbers, they're a good starting point, but they're not useful if we do not use them to change our practices and to make sure that our interventions are well coordinated and target those most in need. And for example, at the OECD, we try to offer platforms for development actors to engage in peer learning and policy dialogue, so that we can actually better connect both the gender equality and the climate agendas. And the last thing I wanted to mention here is that, yes, I mean, of course, increasing resources is crucial, but it's not going to be enough. We also need to increase the impact of financial flows, and therefore we need strong international frameworks to guide us on this. And for example, the OECD has issued a DAC declaration where development partners have committed to aligning ODA with the goals of the Paris Agreement on climate change. And in this declaration, DAC members, they've also recognized that it's really urgent to support investment in climate action that are gender responsive. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. And going forward, how do you you know, how do you think we can get more development assistance providers to report their data to the OECD? And, you know, not just OECD DAC members, but also those outside of it, including other sources of finance beside ODA.
Yes, getting more and better data on financing of the gender climate nexus is key. And yes, this can be done through having more providers report to what I mentioned is the OECD creditor reporting system by using the OECD gender and climate markers. Now, so the most established and extensive financing data that we have available is that data for official development assistance. So the ODA, which is provided by the 30 members of the OECD Development Assistance Committee. And we have this data for the past 2 decades. So we can also compare the evolution over time. Now, what we also have is that other development actors, such as private philanthropy or some multilateral organizations and banks, they have also started using the DAC gender marker to report on their activities. We even have some development finance institutions that are now reporting their financing against this gender equality policy marker that we have. For example, these are the development finance institutions engaged in what we call the 2X challenge or the 2X collaborative. And these institutions, they have actually last year aligned their investment criteria with our gender equality marker. So all of this is gonna further facilitate monitoring efforts, but we can still make further progress. And what I really wanna say here is that I think also additional sources of financing, they have to complement ODA to support gender equality and climate change, because only with ODA, we're not gonna get there. So it's gonna become increasingly important to mobilize the private sector and to also use blended finance mechanisms, so that we can scale up development and climate finance in support of gender equality. And what we are trying to do at the OECD is also document some of these examples of blended finance vehicles that we can use to advance gender equality. And the last point that I want to make quickly is that I think we have also seen the importance of good financing data, not only in the framework of reporting, for example, on the SDGs, but also more recently when we're gonna try to monitor the commitments that partners have made at the Generation Equality Forum. And the OECD, we have tried also to support this process by issuing a paper which is giving baseline information on development finance that's available across the different action coalitions and the compact, so that we can monitor the evolution over time and that we can look at the different sectors where all this development financing is going. Thanks.
So no, thank you very much, Charlotte. And I should also mention that UN Women, the OECD and UNDP are actually now, you know, have embarked on a new collaboration to look at COVID-19 global response policies, but from a climate justice point of view. So this new tool, which will be released in June 2022, builds on work that OECD has already done and will map existing gender sensitive and green recovery measures in over 200 countries and territories. So the Green Tracker, as we call it, will give decision makers really a concrete overview of whether and to what extent country measures are gender and environment sensitive. And it will equally showcase what works in the design and implementation of the post-COVID recovery measures from a climate point of view. The goal is also to highlight gaps that, to showcase good practices and so on. So I'm going to drop in the chat just more information on that initiative. And you can expect really, I think, this information to come out in the next few months by June of this year. But really, fantastic contribution, Charlotte. Thank you very much. So now, without further ado, I'll just we've had a very vibrant chat discussion with some questions coming through, but also some being answered live. And I'll just start with, I think it clusters around several issues. So I'll just start with the first one, which I think both Steve and Virginia have touched on. Virginia particularly in the chat, but I would definitely like us to spend just a few minutes discussing that. The first question that we received is how can citizen-generated data best be harnessed to complete the broader picture? We know really that citizen-generated data is critical now in the broader data ecosystem, and how do we bring in, how can we contribute to the conversation and the work on gender and environment data? And Virginia, you've answered this question in the chat, but I would definitely want to come back to you on this, which is, how can we ensure that local communities and grassroots women's organizations who are leading local climate adaptation and DRR solutions at the local level do understand the hazards and risks that they face? And what are these information? Where are these information available, and how easy is it to access them? And this definitely, I think, speaks to also Steve, the point that you made about in response to my question. And Virginia, there's also another question around the age of death, the age pyramid of deaths, and why is death for people 80 plus higher, and what are the strategies that are put in place to protect the most vulnerable, and like the elderly, particularly in the UK context?
Only a few questions, Papa, but what a privilege to be asked so many and to have such an incredible discussion. What wonderful contributions everyone has made. I will be as brief as I can. So if I could start, the Sendai framework is about to go through its midterm review, and we would really love you to engage, and I'll put the messages in the chat if that would be helpful, particularly on the gender part of this. So how do we get gender much more into the heart of all of this is really critical in the Sendai framework, and a real opportunity was opened up and shared yesterday, again at the Commission on the Status of Women. So that would be lovely to have that much more engagement, but also the women's groups. Hayuru, you were amazing in the Sendai negotiations. You were there all the time. What a fabulous community of global grassroots women's movement towards building women's leadership and community resilience. Your leadership was so inspiring and so engaging, and we'd love to hear more from you. So our hazard information profiles are very much there for you to use. And one of my colleagues, Maddie Weir, had a wonderful conversation with colleagues from Bangladesh, where people who may not find these profiles so easy to use, it was suggested that they might be converted into songs. So the opportunity to do this seems to be quite amazing. So we'd love to work with you to see how we can make sure that it really works right at the front line, and how we can improve them and enhance them. And for that purpose, we had as partners in the work that we were doing the International Federation for the Red Cross and the Red Crescent. And then the other question you asked me about the pyramid of deaths. Well, we know that more deaths occur in the UK the older you are, and it's this that really worried us. And we spent a lot of time working on how we could deal with these deaths and try and reduce them as much as we could from COVID where it was appropriate. And there was a lot of work that went on there, and we really worked hard, but unfortunately it does seem to be the 80 plus who seem to be the most vulnerable. But it's very important that we report it and share it. That is exactly what our Mongolian colleague was talking about, and his engagement in sharing this information I thought was so important, because if we can target where the most vulnerable are, we can put better resources for better use for people who might be able to deal with these problems more effectively. I have very briefly answered these, but I'll put some more messages in the chat if that would be helpful. Thank you. Over.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And does anybody want to take the question about citizen-generated data? Please feel free to come in.
If I can jump in, Papa, thank you. And Virginia, thank you for the lead into that. Very, very, very good points. The community-generated data, I think part of what we're hearing here is that we need to diversify how we think about data gathering, the data sources, and that's already happening, right? And And as my Mongolian colleague already mentioned, from a statistics office perspective, the idea of looking for additional data sources and looking for ways to validate that data, ensuring it's correct and that it's standardized is absolutely essential. But there's, I think one of the areas that we tend to think less about is that businesses, private sector is very, very active in data gathering and collection. And so at the community level, and looking at how social media data is used and gathered for good. So some platforms such as Facebook, Data for Good program, et cetera, are finding very innovative ways to gather the right kind of data at the community level to ensure the voices are heard there. And so for us, bring that data together, bring it in a way that we can analyze and then provide recommendations. And we look to diversify how we think about data sources would be very important for us. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think this links to definitely one of the last questions that we have is about how do we decentralize data from central to local governments, but also can citizens own those data for more transparency and accountability? And absolutely, I mean, citizens should own their data. They are the primary subjects, but I think again, this data gets useful if different stakeholders come together to analyze it, draw insights from it, and again, basically make sure that that data circulates and is used and reused. So really, thank you very much, Steve, for that. So Sarah, a question on common understanding, definitions, and measuring indicators, and why that is critical. Who do you think in this ecosystem can really help to lead this, given that every sector speaks their own language and have been collecting data based on their own definitions and standards?
I agree and disagree with that a little bit. So it's true that different countries perhaps that needed to start collecting this to respond to their own national priorities have started collecting data on different sectors on the gender and environment. But generally, I feel like the international statistical system is pretty well set up to coordinate, compared to many other sectors in the UN. I feel like it coordinates much better regarding definitions, regarding comparability, etc. So I think that a lot of work is actually ongoing in that regard. And that's why we have this international sets of indicators, and we are working towards expanding these sets. So for instance, as an example, if you take the Sendai indicators, there are clear definitions for the indicators. It's true that they're not far-reaching enough to capture a gender angle, but there is a current review currently ongoing to actually expand these definitions and measure not just direct effects from disasters and climate change, but also indirect effects, etc. So and many different agencies and stakeholders beyond UN agencies are contributing to this review, so which I think is a very important process. And similarly with the we need to recognize the important role that the United Nations Statistics Division plays on this, because they are, at the center of coordinating all these global norms and definitions. And the set of indicators on climate change is a perfect example. I feel like they reach out to everyone and anyone for contributions on these indicators. So it's a very, very important process. And then on our end, really trying to measure the gender environment nexus and putting together the questionnaire, etc. Same story. We really reach out to all the different partners that have been collecting agricultural data, fisheries data, labor data, disaster data, etc., to make sure that we had everyone's practices and everything was kind of standardized. So I feel like it might seem like people really work in isolation, but actually I feel like within the statistical community, there's a lot more coordination than in other sectors. But maybe I'm just optimistic, I don't know.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think within the statistical community, there is definitely more coordination. I think it's really the fact that basically the work on environment, gender and environment goes beyond just the statistical community. Right, so I think there are really important groups, research, but also, as was mentioned, grassroots organizations, line ministries, and so on, that I think really, in that gray zone of user and producer, that really, I think, requires a little bit more coordination across the board. And we've seen that in gender statistics. It's not just environment, it's gender statistics in general, because quite a lot of the work that we've been doing at UN Women has really been to try to bring those different communities together for a better coordination, particularly at the national level, where you really need that coordination to ensure that everybody knows what their contribution is, and and that also leads to better decision making and data use. So thank you very much, Sarah.
I feel like a perfect example here is Mongolia, and maybe Dava can talk about this, because their gender and environment survey, they actually implemented in partnership with the National Disaster Management Agency. So I think that leveraging these types of partnerships within the national statistical system is very important to make sure the ministries are engaged as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that was also, I think, one of the questions to say, for Mongolia to, what were, some of the challenges that you faced when conducting this survey, including basically linking, putting these partnerships together. Madava, over to you.
Thank you, Papa. So let me just touch upon some technical aspect of the challenges that we have faced during the data collection process of the survey. Firstly, it coincided with the COVID-19. So we had to move the data collection to the telephone interview. And since the question was quite long, it created some difficulties for us to maintain the quality. And secondly, I think now the data collection is done, and the tabulation and then the processing stage has begun with the UN Women. And one of the consideration we have is that due to the big size of the country, the occurrences of the national disasters are differing among the different regions, and it could be a problem that the selection of those who are affected by the natural disasters could be very difficult. So therefore, we have to really think about other data sources to validate the results of the surveys. And with regards to the difficulties facing with the cooperation with the government agencies, in terms of the management level, the other government organizations, especially these disaster management people, they think when we do a survey, they think it's like a really easy process. We call people and then we just have results, but they think often don't know the process of designing the survey, and then conducting a pilot survey to test our questionnaires and etc. And then processing stage take quite a lot of time. And also most of the time the government institutions have quite a lot of data demand, so they want to put in too many questions into the survey and etc. So this for this we have to explain what would be the main focus, that we have to focus on the main things other than the policy agendas of this disaster management people. And of course, we had to accommodate most of the requests from their side. And also, even though we provide them data, and from the results of the data, we'll be giving them the results. It's really important for us to help them to work with the data, to help them understand the data, because most of the time they don't have a specialized people working with the data to help them to come up with the better policy decisions. So what we are planning with the UN Women is, after the survey results are available, we will be holding a training sessions for the staff and the people to understand the data more and help them to use the data more. Over to you, Papa.
Thank you very much. And there's actually another question that came in to say, and this is more a question perhaps also of the content of the survey. This contributor essentially is suggesting that given that 2026 is the year of rangeland and pastoralists, to collect specific data on women pastoralists and their risk of and adaptation under options under climate change. So has there been any data collection on women pastoralists? Over to you, Baldrava. Yeah, the question is. Yeah, the question is whether there's been any data collected on women pastoralists, or if you have any plans to do so.
Yes, actually, together with the UN FAO, I think it's SDG 5.1 that we are conducting the agricultural sector's property ownership by the gender. So we have agreed to conduct this survey with the UN Food and Agricultural Organizations, and we'll be conducting data, the data collection this year through our agricultural census, so that we will see, because in admin data, most of the properties are registered with the household heads or the males traditionally. So we want to conduct really who has the more decision-making power in terms of the property ownership and property trading decisions. And I would mention that we have conducted previously a survey that the property ownership differences between the genders in pastoralist households. And we see that when it comes to the countryside with the herders, there's like 3 times difference between the property ownership between the women to men. So I think in terms of the economic sense and livelihood sense, I think it's really important to continue conducting this survey. So I think with the help from the UN FAO, we will be conducting this. Over to you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, definitely. I think highlighting also the importance of the agricultural census to actually showcase these some of these gender issues. So I just have two final questions that I think are actually open to anyone in the panel who wants to take them. The first question is really about the fact that it seems that there are many countries do collect gender-based data on disasters at local level, but reporting it under the Sendai framework is a challenge. They do not report it. Any insights on what the barriers are to getting the data reported from local level, and how much of this is not seen as necessarily as a high priority in countries. And the second question is about the fact that and this is really, I think, close to dear to my heart, which is that a country might have data, but not necessarily using that data to translate it into decision making, unless more women are at the top of the system. Both, when we are talking about decision making, we're also talking about statistical systems, where women are typically underrepresented as in many other sectors. So how what are your thoughts on really women's representation at these in these systems to ensure that the data then gets translated into policy decision. So this is open to anyone on the panel to take those two questions, any of those two questions.
But maybe I can give a little bit of background on the Sendai question based on what are some of the things that I've seen here in the region, in the Asia Pacific region. So I say that it's indeed true that many countries do collect data on some of the Sendai indicators for both men and women, and they only report a national aggregate. Part of it is simply a lack of time. It just takes the added effort of disaggregating the data and reporting 2 estimates instead of 1. So it's not compulsory, and therefore, it's easier to just report 1 value. But a big part of it is that disaster is very localized data. So some provinces would collect men and women, and some other provinces would collect just totals, and some provinces would collect it but would not report it to the central institution, the National Disaster Management Agency, that would then input the information into the Sendai framework monitor, etc. So the reality is that there's part of it's a lack of time, part of it's a coordination issue, and part of it's really like only for some disasters, typically like when people are less overwhelmed. So when the disaster is smaller, there's more time to actually collect the data with sex disaggregation, etc. So what we see in the Sendai monitor is typically the smaller disasters that affect less people are disaggregated compared to the bigger disasters where people are more overwhelmed and they don't have that additional time to actually report the data. So I don't have a specific solution except, for the need to make it maybe mandatory to report data, disaggregated data across the board. But I think those are some of the challenges that we see often.
Papa, if I may also, if I may also comment to one of your questions.
Yes, please do. Please go ahead.
A country might have data, but that might not be necessarily translated into integrated decision making unless there are more women at the top of the bureaucratic system to ensure that data is incorporated into policies. One of the things during my time in the government as a gender focal point, I was privileged to work under an administration that was led by a woman president. And so I saw firsthand how her priorities differed from previous administration in terms of the increased government fundings for gender equality, for civil society, organizations, and government under gender office, as well as increased attention across the sectors of government and gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. Now, one of the things that I want to touch and refer to Sarah in regards of not getting proper data into the Sendai. I am not sure, but maybe here in the Pacific, in our region, we have gender focal points. So I'm not aware or have you ever considering working through the gender focal points to assist you in getting some of the data that you need for the Sendai? Thank you.
Papa, I can also come in on one of your questions, if that's fine.
Yes, please do, Charlotte. Go ahead.
Yes, so the question about, so the country might have data, but might not use it for decision making. So I want to maybe to reformulate also that a bit and say like, are actually development cooperation providers taking into account that type of data from the countries that they are actually having programs in? Because I was very impressed today by the type of data that different actors are now collecting at national level that shows actually really clearly the gender and climate nexus. But are development cooperation providers also looking at that data? Is that data easily available? And can they use this data to take informed decisions about which countries they're going to be funding, which types of programs they want to be funding, in which sectors they're going to be intervening? So I think that might also be important to take into account from that type of perspective.
Brilliant. No, thank you very much, Charlotte. And really, I think, again, hearty thanks to our brilliant panelists and audience for this very engaging discussion. And now, we are just now towards the end of this panel, but I just wanted to go back to, each of our panelists to ask just, 2 short questions. And, what is the most important change that you wish to see happen in the area of gender data and environment in the next 5 years? And what can your organization do towards this outcome? So, these are loaded questions, but I'll just give you 1 minute each to come in and really, give us some pointed solutions as to what you want to see and how you think your organization can contribute. Maybe we can just start with Molly. Molly, over to you.
Apologies. I'm sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, so the question is, what changes do you want to see, do you wish to see in the area of gender data and environment, and what your organization can contribute? So 1 minute.
Well, one of the things, like I said earlier, one of the things that we really need to make sure and trying to collect some more information on gender and climate change and what's really happening. You know, even with the migrations that we are experiencing, we want to make sure, we want to see what's the correlation with the migration and climate change, and what we are also experiencing here with the king tides, and just recently there was the eruption in Tonga. So emerging issues that we are seeing, that we are experiencing with change, with climate change and all that. I think the Pacific Island country should go back and really look what they want to capture in terms of what they want to see 5 years from now in terms of the changes of what we're going through. One of the things that we have been advocating too is the nuclear legacy that we're the legacy and justice that we have been also very vocal about in terms of, you know, our ocean, the nuclear, the ocean, and our fish, our resource. And so we need to take into account these things and want to see what can we do, what can, you know, what data do we need to see the changes in the next 5 years. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much. Virginia, over to you.
Thank you. To us in health, data is absolutely critical for everything we do. So you have seen that with the COVID example I shared. You've seen how important it is that we understand what data there is so that we can target our resources at the most vulnerable and really try and help them most, but also to bring and use science forward to try and make sure that we support this. So disaggregated data is at the heart of what we do, really, really important. And what would I like to see in the future? I would like to see much more engagement in trying to make sure that the hazard profiles that we've developed, the information profiles, really work for all hazards, but equally facilitate the reporting of the vulnerability and exposures that are so critical for us to determine the risk. And by doing that, we're in a much better position to not only comply with the Sendai framework, but also the SDGs and the Paris Agreement on climate change, bringing it all together and working from a very local to a global level. Let's hope we deliver better.
Thank you very much. Sarah.
Yeah, for me, obviously what I would like to see is like all producers of environment statistics really integrating gender across the board and consistently, but also all users of data and all decision makers really using this data to make decisions, right? And how can you and women help with that? Obviously, we can provide financial and technical support for the data collection, but we're also very well placed to make those linkages between the women's machineries and the you know, data producers to make sure that, you know, we speak to each other and people really use the data, and the data producers really produce the data that is what the users really need.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Badava.
Thank you very much. I think the most important area with regards to the gender and environment nexus that we should be focusing on is, like Virginia said, it's the disaggregated data. So how can we create and increase the availability of the disaggregated data? I think it can be achieved only through the increased quality of the admin data and their connectiveness among their interoperability among themselves. And also we should be using the other alternative data sources like remote sensing, GIS information. So once we have this admin data and the alternative data is available, I think it will be really easier for us in terms of the cost, in terms of the timeliness to produce the indicators necessary to measure the gender-related data. For in this regard, I would like to mention that the NSO of the Mongolia, we have embarked on a new project called Integrated Government Database. So we are aiming to integrate the different admin data created at the different ministries through the common registration number of the citizens and also the companies, so that we'll be focusing more on the data stewardship and data governance issues, so that the quality of the admin data overall should be improving in the coming years, which could be used for the statistical purposes and also the decision-making purposes. Thank you. Over to you, Papa.
Thank you very much. Steve.
Great. So two overarching points, coordination and diversification. On diversification, it's working with new, perhaps stakeholder groups at the local level, understanding as indicators change, right? We set indicators, but those do change with circumstances and differences in resilience and vulnerability. On the coordination point, to Batava's just the point of integration, is we see frequently that data is not shared across ministries, across elements of government, and that coordination is absolutely essential, so that there is a common database of data that'll be useful for decision making. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Charlotte.
Yes, I want to make 2 points. So I think the first one is that we have to better connect the gender and climate communities, because we don't always speak the same language among different types of experts. And that's also necessary to actually better coordinate all this data and the issues really coming together. And what the OECD can do about this is that, so we have different policy networks consisting of, for example, gender experts. We have networks with environment experts, and we're going to increasingly bring those experts together so that we are really at the same table discussing the issues. Second point is that we need to cross additional data sets also going forward, not only looking at the gender climate nexus, but also looking, for example, at issues related to conflict and security challenges, because those issues typically also come when there are pressure on natural resources and when in countries where there are high levels of inequalities.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. And this really brings us to the end of this. And now, sorry that we are a couple of minutes over. But really, I think, again, my sincere gratitude to all of the presenters. And just to share with you that we will make the recording of this webinar available on our website at data.unwomen.org. And the link will be shared with all who registered for this event. Again, really, again, hearty thanks to everyone, particularly to, again, these events go smoothly because of the support that we receive on the back end. So I really want to, express my sincere gratitude to all, including our interpreters who, have been with us the whole time and really have done a fantastic job. But also, the organizers. So everybody who was behind this event to make it happen. Again, I really wish to thank everyone. Just two parting words from me. One is ensuring data use. This is critical. Data are not useful if they're not used. So we really need to, I think, keep that in mind. And the second one is really about ecosystems. Understanding that gender and the environment is really, thinking about it from an ecosystem point of view with different actors that are contributing to the greater good. And that, we really need to strengthen those links in the ecosystem in order for us to really make leaps forward. Again, thank you very much to everyone, and I really wish you to have a very good day, evening, night, depending on where you are. Take care.
Night, thank you.
Thank you very much.